Welcome to Snooze and Stories. I'm your host, and I'm going to read you a bedtime story. Before jumping in, let's take a deep breath. In and out. Breathing slows down your heart rate, relaxing your muscles and mind. Let's begin. Margaret's house stood straight, like it was holding its breath. Each brick was neat, each hedge trimmed. It was the kind of house that knew how to behave, much like Margaret herself. Her mother would have approved, though she'd never say it out loud. She didn't need to. Margaret had always known. Next door, Lucas' house was different. It sagged slightly, as though it had long stopped pretending. Vines crept along its walls, and wildflowers bloomed where they shouldn't. The grass swayed in the wind, untamed. Margaret saw chaos. Lucas, he called it beautiful. The fence, when it first came, wasn't supposed to cause trouble. It was just a fence. Plain wood, tall enough to keep things out or in. Margaret liked the way it felt, solid and reliable. She didn't ask for much from the world, just boundaries. Something that said, this is mine and that is yours. It was simple. Or it should have been. But Lucas didn't see it that way. He had never stayed anywhere long enough to care about boundaries. As a child, he moved from one cramped apartment to another, his mother always chasing the next low rent. They'd slip out in the middle of the night sometimes, avoiding landlords who knocked too loud. Home, to Lucas, was something borrowed, never owned. He had grown up between peeling paint and stairwells that smelled of other people's dinners. In neighborhoods where fences were luxuries. Margaret's neighborhood was different. People here belonged. They had roots, deep ones. But Lucas felt it in his bones. He didn't belong. He was just a guest passing through, no matter how long he stayed. You don't need a fence, Lucas said one morning, his feet bare on the grass, wet with dew. It cuts up the space. We're neighbors. Shouldn't things flow? Margaret stood stiff. She had learned early on that life required lines, limits, and rules. It's just a fence, she said. I have the right. Lucas shrugged. Sure, but do you need it? The question lingered. The question lingered unanswered. Margaret didn't want to admit it, but Lucas had hit something deep within her. She looked at the fence, standing tall, making the divide between them. It wasn't about the wood, nails, or property lines. It was about something that went further back, something lodged deep in her past. An old need for order, for security. And in this quiet town, the divide between Margaret and Lucas started to feel bigger. The old neighbors, who had lived there for decades, nodded approvingly at Margaret when they passed by. She was upholding tradition, maintaining orders. Exactly the way things had always been. The rules are meant to be followed. And Margaret was setting an example. The younger residents, on the other hand, people like Lucas, newer to the neighborhood, eyed the fence with disapproval, though most wouldn't say it aloud. They didn't believe in walls, in keeping people out. The town had its unspoken divisions. The older generation, conservative and rooted in the past, stood with Margaret. The newer, younger neighbors, those more like Lucas, saw the fence as unnecessary, maybe even harmful. But no one said it directly. It was just there, in the looks, the whispers, in the quiet moments between neighbors. Lucas, meanwhile, couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider. He had always been on the edge of places like this. He looked around and saw what privilege looked like. Quiet, inherited, unquestioned. People with Margaret had deep roots here. Lucas? He had none. One evening, the whole town gathered in the town hall. The fence was the topic. But it wasn't really about the fence. It was about the belonging. About who had the right to say where the lines were drawn. Margaret spoke first. "It's just a fence," she said, her voice steady, but her hands trembling slightly. "I'm not asking for much." Lucas didn't argue. He didn't have to. He simply looked at her and said, "But do you really need it?" The question again, hanging in the air. Too big for her to answer. Time passed, and the fence stood. But it didn't stay the same. The wood began to fade and crack, and vines slowly crept over it. At first, Margaret tried to pull them off, but they kept coming. Lucas didn't mind. He let his garden grow wild. Seeds from his yard drifted across, landed on Margaret's side, and grew without permission. Margaret stood at her window, watching as the wildflowers took roots in her perfect lawn. She sighed, not because she regretted the fence, but because she had come to realize that it hadn't changed anything. The space between her and Lucas remained as wide as ever. Lucas still wandered barefoot through his yard, smiling at the flowers as if they were old friends. Margaret still pruned her hedges, kept her grass neat. They didn't speak much anymore. They didn't need to. The fence did all the talking. And yet, sometimes, Margaret would glance through the vines, watching Lucas lie on the grass, staring up at the sky like it held answers. She wondered, just for a moment, what it would feel like to live in a world without fences. Maybe the lines we draw don't protect us at all. Maybe they just keep us trapped in our own corners. In the end, Margaret won. The fence stayed, but she wasn't happy. She knew now that she hadn't needed the fence. Not really. But a part of her, the part shaped by her childhood, needed that barrier to feel safe. The fence stood. But it didn't matter anymore. The vines kept growing. The wildflowers spread. Nature had its own way of undoing the things we built. Because in the end, nature always wins. It always has.